You just couldn't improvise? No worries. Okay. No, it's fine. Okay, cool. Anyway, so sign up for Synac and get bugs. We're kind of a combination of bug bounty program, vulnerability finding, and we build tools to help the bug bounty people try to find vulnerabilities quicker. Do I still need to wear the mic on my ear? Or? It is? Oh, cool. All right. So why did I give this talk? I was chatting with, I think, Tango Down on Twitter, and she's like, we need more green track talks. And I had some really phenomenal mentors in my professional career. Does anyone know JCase on Twitter? No? Does a lot of awesome phone hacking. He taught me how to attack Android devices. Let's see, look out at Tim and Caleb Felton. They're some of the best Android reversers, I think, in the world. Zeno and Corey taught me reverse engineering at MITRE, and how I was an intern, I just emailed them randomly. They weren't even in the state I was in. I was like, I'm a dork and I really like your stuff, will you be my best friend? And they actually wrote back, and it was kind of cool. And then they taught me x86. Tom McGuire, I took his class at Hopkins, and I actually didn't meet any of his prereqs, and I just took it. And we're kind of like buddies, and I get free beer from his brewery. And a bunch of shy people at MITRE. And I say this because I also had a lot of really crappy mentors and professors in my professional and academic careers. And I find it really sad when people are fascinated about learning these kind of technical skill sets, and then they get, kind of disillusioned either in a bad class or they had a bad boss or mentor or something. So good mentors, I talked about that. And a good mentor is always going to be supportive and not be a jerk and kind of help you learn these things. People to avoid. Avoid people who aren't going to answer your questions or assume you don't know what you're talking about because you're taking the time out to ask them something. And people who assume you're doing things wrong from the get-go. So I used to teach karate to special needs kids, and one of the things I found really helpful is I broke things into people's learning styles. So if you're a visual learner, like me, where I like reading a lot of books, throughout this talk I will give you books, slides, and other resources to supplement things. If you're an auditory learner, everywhere I could find classes or YouTube videos, I'm going to give you that too. And if you're kinesthetic, where you learn by doing, I'll give that good, practical, fun exercises to kind of learn these skills. So, Security Operations Center. We're going to talk about some practical OSI model things, IDS systems and data sets, and host analysis. Who's a student in the room, out of curiosity? So we've got about 50-50. Okay, cool. Let's see. So, highly recommend books here. TCP/IP Guide, the TCP/IP Illustrated Volume 1. This book's been around since 1980-something. It's huge. It's like a phone book. But if you're academic books, you ever want to dive into something, that's really good. And I believe the author of the third one just spoke before me. So a lot of these exercises you can learn very well out of these books. So who's seen the OSI model before? Awesome, cool. I had a network background, so I had to learn this stuff. So we're going to talk about fun things at a few different layers. Who's done ARP spoofing? Oh, okay, actually only, I don't know, a tenth. So a few things here. If you're a auditory learner, I taught an 8-hour class. It's up on YouTube, Intro to Flow Analysis. The first 2 hours, we go through this OSI model, I think, really well. So if you want any more audio talk about that, check that out. Another one is, who's ever done subnetting before? Yeah? Hard when you first learned it? Yeah? Okay, who's heard of Peter Packet? No? Okay. I actually gave this to a bunch of undergrads. Cisco made a cartoon TV show designed to teach high schoolers and entry-level students subnetting. So Peter Packet lands on a planet that's not subnetted properly, and you have to help him. Yeah, it's true. But it's actually really, really good. So if you need walkthrough on some of those, I found it really helpful. So ARP spoofing is really cool, and I think a lot of people don't get to do it. So essentially, when you layer 2 network, ARP's important because how it works is my phone hops on the Wi-Fi here, it shouts out to your broadcast address, hey, who's my router? And then router or the LAN, the gateway, responds. ARP spoofing, because ARP is stateless, it's basically whoever responded last or most frequently, that becomes the gateway. So what you do is you essentially just spam that subnet with you pretending to be the gateway or the router, and then you can see everything, which is pretty cool. And I say this because I do a lot of IoT attacking stuff. And Some of the things what I find frustrating is I can't configure the network on these devices. They kind of auto-join. So I have to forcefully do ARP poisoning, but then I can see all the kind of stuff going up, right? So who has like IoT in their house right now? Like a juicer, a coffee maker, PlayStation? Yeah? Do a little ARP spoofing and see what kind of comes out there. You'd be kind of surprised how frequently it pings things. So now we're going to talk about man in the middle. Who's done man in the middling in the room? Okay, a little bit more people. Cool. So for a very awesome setup for this is a Malware Analysis Cookbook. Chapter 7 talks about how you can configure like a little man-in-the-middle box with a Raspberry Pi or any kind of old Linux server. And this is cool because you allow yourself to essentially go, inspect, modify, or block all the traffic, right? So if you want to see like what happens when I don't know, my little brother's playing PlayStation and I pause his traffic when he's playing Call of Duty. You can kind of see how those things happen, right? And then we're going to get to our kind of higher layers of your OSI model, so we can do fun HTTP proxy stuff. Who's ever played with a proxy and looked at traffic before? Cool. All right. Some people, about a third. This is really cool because when I was in undergrad, often they kind of give me boring, like, let's inspect CNN.com or something, web samples. And I think now that there's so many interesting apps out there, you can do this a lot more fun. On your phone, you can do this pretty trivially. You can just go into settings and set up a little proxy with man-in-the-middle proxy or burp, and I'll give links how to do that. So I had a coworker in my current job. His name's Nathan. He also did the grammar on these slides, so if there's any mistakes, blame him. Nathan was listening to a streaming radio service, and he's like, I hate these ads. And I was like, you know, you can just like look in Wireshark and TCP dump and these kind of proxy tools and mess around with it. And he was like, no. So we started to do that, which was a lot of fun. For those who don't know, super easy to set up a proxy. All you're going to do is Firefox, Chrome, or your phone, kind of go to your network settings, and just pop in your IP address and the port. Super easy. And a lot of people get concerned if they see HTTPS. They kind of freak out. They're like, oh, I can't intercept stuff. Not the case. You can just put a fraudulent cert on there, and you can decrypt it. Now, there are ways around that, but less than 10% of apps do it right, so don't worry about it. I'm serious. It's really bad. So I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, you can't really see that well. Basically, I started looking at all these get and post requests, right? And this is man-in-the-middle proxy. It's kind of like burp. But basically on the bottom, you're seeing a bunch of content that kind of looks like audio files. So just by like, I was doing this, I think, a few nights ago, so I had to listen to a lot of like Taylor Swift and other pop artists. And what you could see is you can start to get a feel. So you can kind of see like, oh, .AAC, that's multimedia things. As I'm seeing, I'm loading, I'm skipping a lot on iHeartRadio because I want ads to show up over and over and over and over again. And as you go through every get and post request, you start to understand, oh, okay, like these are the parameters. This is how they keep track of how long I listened before I skipped, how long until the number of free skips you're allowed to. You can see that start incrementing, which is really, really cool. So the other things I noticed, like it'll say number of active streams, days, or you're apparently allowed to skip so many times a day, and number of skips remaining. So one of the things my friend and my mentee started doing was he started messing with these values, right? Like, oh, how do I get a free account? How do I modify these kind of things? And he started learning a lot just, looking at this. We also mentioned you can learn how the APIs work, right? So he then wrote his own little filter because he would see every AWS URL come through, and then the add ones had a very blatant different domain scheme, and he could just blacklist all those, wouldn't load. So that's what I'm saying that's a fun example, right? So go find a service you like, or your kids like, or your sibling, and play around with it, right? You learn a lot. We mentioned HTTPS traffic. So story time. I can't use this app, but my company did write about it. Have you guys heard of the application? I think it's called Hi There. No, it's basically Tinder for marijuana enthusiasts. And, oh yeah, it's bad. So they did fix all these bugs. That's why I can talk about it. So what it was is the idea is you would find people who enjoyed that activity and you would swipe. But they kind of implemented it really bad. First off, all the traffic was over HTTP, which is bad, because in some states that's illegal. Two, illegal in terms of that activity everyone enjoys on that app. And the other problem they had was I would swipe, and then what they would do is they would send your GPS coordinates up to their server, and then they would send a big JSON file of everyone around you to the phone, and then it would randomly go through and pick one. This is a problem for a few reasons. One, even if that person didn't pick me, I can know about 60 or 70 people in my geographic radius, which is bad. And two, they'd never validated if your GPS position changed a lot. So through the API, you could just repeatedly hammer different zip codes and different longitude, longitude coordinates and kind of see everyone in a huge geographic area. So it was bad. But they have fixed these, which is good. So IDS systems. Who's played with an IDS in the room before? A few people? Okay, cool. I wish I did this sooner in my career, both as a student and professional. These books are phenomenal. The first two are from Richard Belitek. I think he's at Mandiant or FireEye now. The one on the left, it's thick. It's starting to age a little bit, but still really, really good. Network security monitoring is phenomenal. Every time before I've done a blue team interview, I've read that on a flight. And the last one, this is actually good if you want an interest in defensive from more of a managerial or structured process. Carson Zimmerman, he was at MITRE. I think he's at Microsoft now. It's a free book online. Phenomenal write-ups in there. So audio learners, there's tons of great content on this. BSides talks have this. Intro to flow analysis, we talked for an hour on how do you find bad guys on large area networks. And we assume no prereqs, which is pretty cool. Intro to Bro is phenomenal. It's one of my favorite intrusion detection systems. It's much better now than it was 7 years ago. And Liam Randall's training is really, really good too. And he does a lot of BSides training. So if you ever get a chance, I highly recommend you take it. So public data sets. Who's looked at a big attack data set before? No? It's fun. Check it out. There's tons of them out on the internet, like the DEF CON CTF. You can go through and just look what that looks like, right? A lot of your Department of Defense and military colleges release free data sets online because they do little hacking team competitions. And what I like about those is one of the ones we did for the flow class is we kind of went through these very basic attacks and then got more and more and more complicated. So this is what a basic Nmap scan looks like with flow data. And what's interesting here is once you understand flow data, it's kind of like a telephone bill for network. So you can't see what's sent, but you understand who's talking to who, your source ports, your destination ports, IP addresses, and then how long that was, number of bytes, and number of packets. And what's cool is you can actually very quickly figure out recon behavior, right? And then from there, what we did is we walked through students like, what's an easy Trojan port? We'll say, this talks in port 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what you can do then, you can start telling this like attacking narrative. You say, okay, I saw a bunch of really noisy scanning behavior. Here's what it looks like. And then I saw Trojan behavior. Let's figure out what happens next, right? And then you can say, okay, this box, we know this box is popped. What else does it talk to? And it's really easy to do with these flow tools and intrusion detection tools. And because these public data sets are free, available online, you can do this in your home if you want. So fun exercises to learn these skills. Any of the public data talks are great. And just kind of start basic. Like, okay, if I'm a bad guy, I have to scan a network, what would that look like? Right? What's unusual about that? Can you identify lateral movement, which is when you move from one victim machine to another, right? Because if you pop a laptop, for example, then you got to go to a domain server, right? How would that look? A lot of these IDS systems can actually extract files out, which is really cool, because then you can put those in VMs and understand how they work. What do they look like on disk? And another good thing, if anyone's students in here, or even industry professionals, I highly recommend the CCDC hacking conferences. Has anyone been to those? No? Okay, a few. This is really cool. So essentially the premise is what they do is they take students, they give them a fully simulated enterprise network. So domain controller, web server, a database, a bunch of clients, and they're compromised from the get-go. And then they have professional hackers break in. And what the cool thing is, they keep having them extend these networks, which making it weaker and weaker. And even as an adult or a non-student, you can go in there and pay to watch these kids freak out over an 8-hour period because they get their butts handed to them like all day. It's really good for recruiting. No, it's true. You can see them when they really freak out and stuff, right? And it's just really interesting to see, like the red team will try to do things to make it more and more apparent. Like they'll purposely crash their rats and other attack tools, hoping that the students will pick up on it. So we talked about those two, and then host analysis stuff. These 3 books are phenomenal. The red one saved me in grad school a lot. I think that's it's more aimed for static reversing, but they've got really great chapters that basically talk about, okay, how would you monitor certain things on a Windows machine? How do you look at registry keys created? How do you look at methods of persistence? And now you're seeing a lot more memory malware in production environments. So Art of Memory Forensics is a really good book too. So for classes, one of my coworkers, Veronica Kova, taught I think a 2-day class in malware dynamic analysis. So you don't have to do reversing. It's just, here's a machine. How do you quickly figure out what happened? So you learn how to use these tools where it essentially takes like a registry snapshot before and after. You learn how to see how process trees kind of change over time. You learn all the ways you can hide on a Windows box. It's really good. So resources. Microsoft actually has free limited use VMs that not a lot of people know about. They're designed for web developers to test your app in the various web browsers. Well, you can do anything with them. They work for about 30 or 90 days. So if you're looking for a free like little Windows VM for malware stuff, go pull these down. So fun exercises. That red book I mentioned, really good. Check it out. They have some really fun malware where essentially you start to run it and it'll do little checks. So you have to learn to break parts of it for it to continue execution. And the nice thing about that book is they have like little short answers and then very long verbose walkthroughs too of all the tools. So reverse engineering. So 2 prereqs if you want. Who knows what reversing is actually first off? Okay, actually only half. I think it's really cool. It's what I do for a job. It's when you take apart other people's apps that they either don't want you to, or you have to attack it, or it's malware. And it's really, really fun because you get to understand all the innards of OSs. It opens up tons of job opportunities. You can do like reverse engineering malware. You could write own exploits. A lot of opportunities. And to do this, you actually really only need 2 prereqs, depending on what language you're doing it in. Who's done a Java class in the room? A few people? Yeah. If you know Java, you can start reversing Android apps right after this talk. Serious. And if you know, who's done C? Les? Okay, actually, that's a good turnout. If you know C, you can watch the courses I'm going to recommend after this to understand how the stack works. So we're going to start with some basic Android reversing skills. Super easy to get these apps. All you're going to do is there's something on GitHub called the Google Play API, and it basically pretends to be a phone. So you can go out to Google Play, grab your apps, and suck them down. And then there's these 2 free tools that allow you to start taking that apart. The first one, do you see the one with the white background? Yeah? I don't know if you can make out the text, but that is basically a tool called JD GUI. And you're going to use something called dex2jar to make that more easily readable. And the black tool is something called APK tool, which is the disassembly. So I like to equate this to essentially like English and then like Shakespearean English. So the disassembly, it's your kind of ground truth. You always can view it. I think you get the most out of it. And your decompiled is a little less verbose, but easier to read. It's more like source code. And I'm going to give you a little Android 101 so you understand some of these things here. Anyone written an Android app in the room? No? Okay, this is fine. It's everything you'll need. You don't have to read any Google documentation after this. An APK is just a zip file. First is you have a manifest. That's your high-level info. It's like a table of contents. It's basically what the permissions are, what the app can do. That's all you have to worry about. Meta-INF is signer information. Google actually works, it's like public-private key, so I sign an app, you can check it. That's how Google Play updates work. Classes.dex is your actually compiled machine code. So remember from like your entry-level CS classes, you write your source code, gets compiled usually in some kind of object code or your assembly, right? And then from there, it is translated to your binary, your zeros and ones. The classes.dex is your 0 and 1s. That's what those free tools I mentioned do. They convert that to something more readable. Then you have your lib. So on Android, you actually can do C code. You'll see this in video games, some malware, and some security tools. But we're not going to touch any of that today. And lastly, you have like assets and resources, which is like pictures and images and other things like that. So, basic structure. An activity, if you can touch it, it's an activity. Like if you touch a button and something happens, activity. Services run in the background. So if you're doing a music service, right? If I'm on Facebook, I can also be listening to Spotify at the same time, right? That's a service. Receivers take some kind of input, right? So who's noticed on Netflix where if you go off Wi-Fi, it like pops up. It's like, hey, you're going to use all your data plan, right? That's an idea of a receiver. So it can look for changes in phone behavior. So change in connection, an incoming text message, all those kind of things. And lastly, you have content providers, which is one way of sharing data in between apps. It's just a slightly convoluted, like SQL-like language. So we talked about the manifest. I'll skip this here. Permissions, right? So Android's neat because you have a bunch of permissions here, right? Example, you can play around with what kind of location data you want. Like course location uses more of your battery because it's got to ping the GPS more than the other kinds, right? If it can receive SMS or parse your SMS, you'll see these kind of permissions in there. The next thing is, how do you find the starting point in an app? And a lot of people get super intimidated by this, but it's actually not that bad. All it is an XML file, and you're just going to look for the tag application, and then you look for activity, and it'll have a name there. And that Android intent.action.main, all that means is when you push the little shortcut for an app, that's what pops up first. That's all you got to know. So, this is Somali time. Who's a fan of Reddit in the room? A few people? All right. Do you guys remember the Carter thing on Reddit? One guy. All right. So I'm going to teach you in 5 minutes the basics of Android reversing language ends. And it can be a little bit dry, so every time you learn a new concept, I put a photo of Carter. And the idea of Carter was he's a random kid. He knocked on his neighbor's door who never met this kid before, said, "Can I have a banana?" and then just ate it. And a whole subreddit popped up of like funny Photoshops. And I say why you have to learn this because a lot of the free tools, people like me and others, we know how to break those. So when you reverse an app, you might not always have the pretty Java-like source code view. Or you can buy Jeb, which is actually really nice. It's about $120 a month, and you can actually see source code on one side and then the disassembly on the other. So it's really nice for learning. But you do have to pay a fee. I think they have a 30-day trial. So we mentioned APK tool. There's a nice Sublime plugin, and there's also a Vim plugin if you want to see pretty syntax highlighting. Okay, so this big, scary, multicolored text thing within 4 minutes is not going to be scary at all for you. We're going to cover how classes look, fields, method parameters, and other things. So, first things first. Class is purple, and then you're just going to have a file name. Super easy. In Java, right, you have those 4 things: public, private, protected, and package. That's it. So class is keyword, right? And then the type of Java, and then the name of it. So this one's called main activity. Super means you inherit from another object, right? So in this case, it's inheriting from activity, which makes sense because it's like activity, and then you have all your custom activities, right? Super easy. Source is the name of it. Now this is neat because in Android, when you build an app, there's a little checkbox that says try to obfuscate my code. And what that means is main activity becomes like a dot whatever. And a dot whatever will have methods like b dot whatever, and it could have attributes like c dot whatever. So some older versions, they didn't take out the source name. So what's fun from a reversing perspective is I'll see like A, B, C, D, E, etc. I'll go into one, and it'll say source like super secret encryption routine. It shouldn't be public, right? And that's where this is useful. Okay, this is the hardest part here. Variables are pretty easy. How it works is you have V for void, B for bytes, S for shorts, C for chars, I is for integers, J is for longs, F for floats, and D is for doubles, and L for object. I don't remember this. I just look it up when I need to. So I don't know if you guys can see these things here. But basically, you have some EU, DL, whatever, colon. That means it's a integer, right? And the next one, this IEOD, CSD, whatever, L means it's some object. And I'll talk about what shared preferences are. This is the hardest part of the talk, too, by the way. Then you have arrays. Arrays just means a bracket. Right, so this one is a char array, right, because it's just bracket and then C for char. And you can also, the other one is L, which means object for a string. And you see what kind of object after it. So what does a method look like? So it starts with the keyword method and ends with end method. It's kind of like a sandwich, right? You're going to have type. Remember those 4 Java ones we talked about before: public, private, protected, and package. And next you're going to have the name of it. So in this case, it's called onCreate, which is what happens when you first click an activity on Android. And then you have your parameters. So this one, it takes a bundle object. So L, and then the name of the object. And lastly, what it returns. And this one means V for void. Then you have a number of local variables in there. The parameter. So in this one, it's called saved instance state. And that makes sense because a bundle is essentially like the context or the state of the application when it starts. And let's see, function parameters. Here's a little bit more complex example. So this method's called init, and takes first a z for a boolean, and then a string, and then an int. And I did this one because it looks really, really weird when all these things are put together, because only the L or the objects have that little semicolon separating them. So when you reverse, you might see something that takes like, gosh, what's a good example? Like I, D for like a bunch of integers and then a double. Okay. It's the hardest part of this. So in a few minutes, I'll go through some really fun capture the flag exercises, and we're going to break some of the top password apps live, and then I'll talk about that too. Sure. Shoot. Yes. Yeah. Beautiful. So you can do, so the question was, does Jeb just take those rules and make it Java? Yeah. So it's Java-like, so it's the best interpretation of it. So sometimes you'll end up with like slightly different loops structure. Like instead of like a for loop, it'll be a while loop with like a try catch. But I think you can start with dex to jar and JD GUI, and I'll show you this live in a few minutes. And I would try the trial for Jeb too. Yeah, it's really good for learning because you can do side by side, and you can actually highlight where you are in the Java with the assembly. So you can figure out how 1 line of Java is like 5 lines of assembly, which is really cool. Okay, for C, x86. So if you ever want to write exploits and be a cool hacker person, or take apart malware or shadow broker dumps, this is stuff you're going to need. Practical Malware Analysis, in my opinion, by far the best book there. They walk this through very, very nice. Practical Reversing is actually kind of decent for ARM. There's not many good ARM reversing books, which is how like the mobile apps work. And lastly, for 32-bit x86, is this one on the side here. So if I ever wrote a book, I probably wouldn't put my face on the cover, but yeah. The other thing is Intel and ARM have these huge instruction manuals. It's like 4 phone books. They're free online, and if you find a mistake in them, they usually send you free paper copies. So, yeah. So audio learners, tons of content here. Intro to x86 is what I learned. I cried the first time I took it, but then I taught it a few years later. So you can learn these things. It's about 2 days of content. Intro to Reverse Engineering teaches you how to use a tool called IDA Pro, which is kind of the de facto standard. Then we do reversing malware one, which is kind of neat, where they walk through some of the samples from the practical book I mentioned, and some common ones in enterprises today. And Intro to ARM is another one, too. I should also say, Malware Unicorn on Twitter, she just released a really good training content, too, and after the talk, I'll link to that as well. So when you start learning reversing, who did a data structures class back in the day? Remember the stack? Yeah? So the stack is how, on C code, how all your kind of local variables work. So you have to understand how your C code and the assembly interact with that stack. And how all these talks and the lectures I linked to, they basically start one instruction at a time. So you spend about 10 to 20 minutes on how does pop work, how does return work, how does call work, with basic hello worlds. And then it gets a little bit more complicated. They'll go, okay, how do you add 2 values? How do you subtract 2 values? Then they start talking about how parameters work, the kind of data storage, how like an integer and array would look differently. Then they talk about loops, conditional statements, too. And there's who's heard of the Carnegie Mellon Bomb Lab? No? It's the coolest lab I ever heard of. So apparently, when it was taught at Carnegie Mellon, the idea is the professor gives you a binary bomb to defuse. And there's 6 phrases or keys you got to put in to defuse it. And every time you did one wrong, it would like deduct off your final grade, which was kind of cool. And essentially, this is really nice because each step of the bomb defusal teaches you or reinforces part of the reverse engineering skills. The first one is like you have to find a phrase. And the second one is like you go through a loop and you have to calculate some values every step in the loop, right? So it builds very nicely. All right, bug bounty stuff. Here's kind of my bread and butter here. I do a lot of mobile bug bounties. I'm going to talk about some fun skills and fun proof of concepts and practical examples, and then we'll talk about some web stuff too. So two of the best books out here is Mobile Application Hacker's Handbook and the iOS Application Security Book. I cannot highlight these more. They're phenomenal. OWASP is really good. Who's heard of OWASP in the room? A lot of people? Cool. So OWASP, it's basically recommended web defenses and common web attacks. Now they've started doing mobile ones, and they have samples and code, and I have contributed to that. My friend and mentor, Jay Case, has a blog called Barbecue and O-Days that he gives great barbecue recipes, and he rips apart really poorly designed popular apps in a funny manner. The other good one is this phenomenal talk called 7 Ways to Hang Yourself with Google Android. It was at DEF CON. It's slightly dated, but still really good for the foundations. And I have the video talk there, and you have my audio lecture. So, fun app reversing time here. These are the top 2 password or picture storage apps in Google Play. My friend Jay Case found these. I'm just going through these live with you guys. And we're going to see how poorly they implement this stuff. So, again, how do you download? I use the Google Play API and GitHub. Makes it really easy. If you have, even on a non-rooted phone, you can enable something called ADB, hook it up, and dump them that way too. So Jeb, you just open it in there, make it super easy to read. If you want to use the free tools, you unzip it, and then open it up in the Dexter jar, and then use that open in JD GUI. Or if you want hard mode, you can do it with APK tool and Vim and Sublime, and those little Carter, Reddit, Photoshops will help you.
Hello folks, Iron Geek here. Unfortunately, we're having technical difficulties throughout this talk, and at this point, my new capture device decided to freak out and just not record any audio. Sorry for the inconvenience.